fees and all that.
What would somebody would pay to go in, and then what would Andy Potato Chips say, or what would or what would you do? What was your act?
Well, there was a talker. There was a guy named I think his name was Charles Lucas. We called him Woof, or Keith says it's Woofu, like a Chinese name, but come to think of it, maybe Presto, when he told me about it, was saying Woofu, and I thought he was saying woof, because I thought woof was more romantic. But he would be the one. He was like really glib. I mean, he could really, and I mean that in a good way. He could really talk things up and make them sound really good. And much like Ward Hall. Ward Hall can do the same thing. And you just can't, you're just on the edge of your seat listening to these people. So he introduced me as Dutch from Amsterdam. And I just did a very simple juggling act. I rode a unicycle and juggled, and then I juggled battle axes. I thought that was my in for being in anything like a freak show, was to do something weird like battle axes. Not many people did battle axes in those days. And and then I would usually, I also had this 7-ball bouncing thing I did, but I need a good stage for that. So I had to jump down from the ballet stage onto the concrete floor, and the audience sort of formed a ring around me for the ball bouncing, and that concluded my act. And then Wolf would take over and introduce the audience to the next act, and they would just move right along. The talker or lecturer is very important in a show like this, because he's the audience's guide. Every sideshow I've ever seen has had one. And he tells the people to come over. And very often also, with many sideshows, not just Hubert's, they'll sell a postcard or something. Each act will sell a postcard to the audience at the end and sign it, and for $1 or something like that.
Did you have a card?
I sort of had a card, but not when I was there. Years later, probably, I started having a card that had the 7-ball bounce on it that I would sort of hand out at juggling conventions and things like that.
So your act was a juggle. I mean, who did you have to go to apply to work at Hubert's?
I went right to the lecturer. I probably went to a performance. When I got to the performance, I went to the lecturer when he wasn't working and asked him if he wanted to hire me as a juggling act, and he was glad to have me, actually. I don't know what a juggling act was doing there exactly. But
who was that? You went up to apply to the lecturer, you just went and...
Yeah, Wolf.
Oh, it was Wolf.
Yeah.
And you went up and said, I can juggle, or...
Yeah. He wore a fez. He wore a nice suit and an Egyptian fez, a red little cap with a black tassel. He always wore that. And he had a little mustache, a brush mustache, and he was good. He was great at what he did. And he's the one that hired me, and he was pretty much in charge. He's the one that paid me. I don't remember. I think I probably got paid in cash. It wasn't a lot of money, and I do remember that. But to be there and performing and get paid for it was great. I loved that.
So this was something, must have been a real thrill then. I mean, if this was a place you remember as a kid, and then to do that, was that something? Was it a real? I mean, I don't know. I guess it's to have a year-round sideshow. It just sounds really significant and unusual.
Well, it wasn't terribly glamorous. The people that came in to see the show were not always as excited about it as I would have been. I mean, I thought it was great, to be sure. But, you had across the street, you had these movie houses, which you called triple feature for 50 cents. So movies that were 5 or 6 years old, you could see 3 of them for 50 cents. And so it was kind of, I don't want to say run down, but it was not, it was not all that glamorous. It was more, I wouldn't say I was slumming, but it was, it had a little more of that panache feeling to it than, hey, this is the greatest show on earth, and it is the greatest show on earth. It was, but, I didn't really know it at the time.
But I guess the inside was kind of, you said there were butterflies on the wall or stuff, like the old collections?
Yeah, collections of like pinned and preserved butterflies were all over the walls of the little room where the flea circus used to take place. which was a square room that had like a railing around it, and the fleas performed within that railing. I assume that the audience leaned on the railing. Once in a while we would go in there. I don't think it was locked, because we were employees. We could go in there if we wanted to, or at least ask to be taken in there.
What, and could you just give a list of some of the greats who did perform there? And some, like you mentioned, like Waldo, and describe what he did.
Yeah, well, Waldo was a regurgitator. There were pictures of him on the wall, so I assume he did perform there. You'll see pictures of him with little white mice in his mouth, and he presumably swallowed them and then regurgitated them alive. I'm not sure that would be permitted today. Might be problems with that. CeeLo, I think, probably performed there, was like who had no arms, but just little hands coming out of his shoulders, and he would usually shave. He was very charming. He would shave one side of his face and claim he was saving the other side for for the next audience that he would have. He was pretty clean shaven most of the time, even though he's doing one side of his face at a time. And the legendary blockhead, Melvin Burkhart, apparently, who died recently, in his obituary, it says that he worked there. So I just learning that this morning when I went on the internet and checking out Hubert's museum.
What about Congo? Who was Congo?
Congo, Presto used to rave about Congo. Everybody who knew about Congo said Congo was so great. And I never saw Congo there. A few years later, there was a small little magic theater that opened up, and Congo worked there, and I saw Congo. And what a rapport with audience did Congo have. I mean, he was wonderful. And you would accuse anyone, if any heckler, and hecklers were pretty prevalent in those days, any heckler would bother Congo, he'd say, "You're cuckoo in the cocoa." And he did things like trying to saw his feet. You know, he'd take a crosscut saw and apply them to the bottom of his feet and try to saw his feet. And nothing would happen, of course. And he was great with the audiences. And he also did magic tricks, like reaching in a bucket of water and pulling out a fistful of dry sand, things like that. But he was supposed to be a wild man, but he was totally civilized. You know, he's totally sophisticated. And I could see why Presto, the magician, had liked him so much. But I never saw him at Hubert's. But he was, you know, he was in evidence that he had been there.
So, but what is the significance about like something what the Bindlestiff's doing and how on 42nd Street and you know this kind of history of this vaudevillian sideshow circus, and the fact that do you feel like it's lost now, or do you think it's always going to be there?
Well, I think it's a pendulum thing. I think it will keep reappearing, whether it's suppressed or dies out. I think it'll keep coming back. And I think that Bindlestiff is like monumental. I mean, it's not quite. I wouldn't say it hasn't had the longevity of Hubert's yet, but it's wonderful to see it come back and have. Well, most of the people now are too young to have worked at Hubert's. They weren't even born then. So for me, yes, it's wonderful to have seen Hubert's, to worked at Hubert's, to have been upset that Hubert's finally closed, and then to have this open up 2 blocks away on the same street. It's just wonderful. And when they invited me to be on their board, I was thrilled, and when I became chairman of the board, I was even more thrilled. Oh yeah, I think for me, in my mind at least, it's all very much connected. And it's exciting. It may die out again, but you know, then it may happen again. What's interesting, I think, to me is that like the sort of American subculture where people are getting tattooed and pierced and stuff like that. That used to be for the sideshow, and now it's like part of our subculture. And I think it's interesting because I think of Stephanie and Keith as being part of that subculture, and then they perform mostly for yuppies, frankly, here. But they also used to have an audience that was very much like themselves.
And you teach at NYU. I mean, what's interesting? You made a leap from performing at Hubert's to the academia.
That's absolutely true because I always loved New York, and I wanted any excuse to live in New York. I was trained in theater, but I loved circus. So what happened is I went from teaching at Hubert. I was studying at Columbia University. I worked at a museum there called Hubert, not Hubert's, it was called Brandon Matthews Dramatic Museum. This was a museum created by the first professor of dramatic literature in the United States, who made many trips to Paris and set up a similar museum. I worked in that museum before I worked in Hubert's. And in the meantime, I got a job teaching circus skills for actors at New York University. And yes, that was the following year. In 1965, I was at Hubert's performing, and the following year, I was at NYU teaching circus skills for actors. And 2 years after that, I got a job in the Electric Circus, which was a discotheque that had circus acts. And so I did both of those together. And then several years later, one of my students became the theatrical director of Circus Flora, and now I work with that circus. And now that I'm more or less retired from NYU, only teaching twice a week, I look forward to going out with my RV and working with Circus Flora.
So you're still an active juggler?
Yeah. Well, what happens in the Circus Flora, we have a juggling act, but we don't hire any jugglers. We just find out what performers who can juggle, and then we put them together in a juggling act, and I usually choreograph that. And so we've had as many as 10 jugglers at once. For a long time, I kept track of everyone who had ever been in the act, and we got up to around 50, and I lost track. But yeah, I'm always in the juggling act, and then whatever other people are good enough at club juggling, they get in the act too.